Hello students, welcome to today's class. Our topic for today is Husbandry of Selected Crops, Part A. Now this topic is quite elaborate, so we'll take a look at it in two sections, Part A and Part B. So let's start with the Part A. So with so much emphasis today on eating natural organic foods, not to mention the rising cost associated with buying them, many people are considering growing their own food crops in their home garden. It's very easy to grow your own food crops, and this could be a rewarding pastime. So in this lesson, we will discuss the husbandry of selected crops. By the end of the lesson, you should be able to state the botanical name, common names, and varieties of selected crops. You should be able to describe the climatic and soil requirements of these selected crops. You should also be able to explain land preparation methods of selected crops. Also outline the method of propagation, that's the production of new plants, the planting date, and also the seed rate of the selected crops. You should also be able to mention the spacing and sowing depth of these selected crops, and also highlight the nursery practices or requirements and cultural practices of the selected crops. Now let's take a look at some cultural practices in crop production. Now, when we talk about cultural practices, these are certain activities that are carried out while cultivating crops. We have what is called transplanting. This refers to the transfer of seedlings from nursery beds to their permanent position in the field. We also have another practice called shading. Now, this is the act of erecting a cover above seedlings to protect the seedlings from harsh environmental conditions such as the sun and the rain. Now, these seedlings are tender and they need to be protected. Seedlings are young plants that have just grown. So certain crops need this protective covering, especially in the nursery, so that they could eventually thrive. Now we have another term called supplying, which is also known as reseeding or filling in. Now this has to do with the replacement of seeds that fail to germinate or seedlings that die. So when those seedlings are replaced, the process is called supplying or reseeding or filling in. We have another term called thinning. Now this has to do with the removal of excess plants or weak plants from a stand in order to reduce competition and also to give rise to one or two vigorous crop plants. That's crops that look very healthy, as against in a stand where you plant 2 or 3 seeds and they germinate. And you find that 1 or 2 weak, you tend to remove those ones and allow the others that are vigorous to keep growing. Then we have another term called weeding, which has to do with the removal of unwanted plants from the farm, and this should be done regularly. Another term is pruning. This has to do with the removal of lower branches of crop plants using a cutlass or unwanted branches of a crop plant. Spacing is another terminology, and it has to do with the distance within and between crops on a plant. Now, we have rows. Crops are usually planted on ridges, which are termed rows. Now, between the plants on the distance between each plant on a particular row is called intra-row spacing, while the distance between a plant on a row and a plant on another row is called inter-row spacing, which is called between or inter-row spacing. We have mulching, which is another terminology that has to do with providing some form of materials like dry leaves, straw, which could be dry stalk of cereal plants, hay, plastic bags, which is called sheet mulching, wood shavings. These are materials that can be used to cover heaps of soil. For example, the yams are usually cultivated in heaps, or other crops that are planted on ridges. You now use these materials to cover the soil around the plant, and that process is called mulching. We have seed rate, which is another terminology or cultural practice in crop production, and this refers to the quantity of seeds that are required to be planted on a hectare of land, which is 10,000 square meters. The nursery is a pre-planting site for seeds which are smaller and delicate while young. So this nursery practice is usually carried out to help delicate young plants, and it's practiced in polypots, seed boxes, or beds. Staking is another terminology that is used. in crop production, and this involves the use of materials like sticks now to help to control or keep certain branches erect, to enable them to climb, especially for creeping plants. So we have certain plants like the yam, tomatoes, which they need some support in order to keep them upright so that they can receive sunlight and prevent direct contact with the soil, which can also cause diseases. So this staking is a process that is very essential to certain crops, creeping plants like the yam plant and the tomato plant. So we have trellising, which is also the same process carried out while you stake. But the difference between trellis is that ropes are used, while for staking, sticks are used. So trellising has to do with the use of ropes to provide support to climbing plants, while staking has to do with the use of sticks to provide support to climbing plants. Pruning, as I said, is the removal of unwanted branches, which I've said earlier. Okay, now let's look at maize plants. We're going to talk about maize plants. We'll get to understand more about its cultural practices, the seed rates, the planting dates, the varieties, and the diseases that are affected, the pests that do affect it. So let's go on now. So maize is the botanical name is called maize, and the land preparation when it comes to maize can be done manually using a hoe or mechanically using a plow, the harrow, or a ridger. So you can plow, you can harrow, you can ridge, and maize is usually propagated by seeds. Now we have different varieties of maize. We have the dent maize, which is called maize indenta, and it's called dent corn, also known as grain corn, and it's a type of field corn with a high soft starch content. Now, they said it receives its name because of the small indentation or dent at the crown of each kernel on a ripe ear or corn. Now, the kernel is also referred to as the seed. So there's actually a dent on that seed. That's why it's called dent maize, which is an indentation. So that's one of the varieties of maize. We have flint corn, which is botanically called maize indorata. Now, it has a hard kernel and comes in multitude of colors. So this is another variety of maize. We have flowery corn, which is maize amylaceae. That's the flowery corn is a variety of corn with a soft starch endosperm and thin pericarp. Now, it's primarily used to make corn flour. We have sweet corn, which is maize saccharata, which is also called sugar corn, and pole corn. It's a variety of maize grown for human consumption with high sugar content. We have pod corn, which is wild maize. It's a variety of maize. It is not a wild ancestor of maize, but rather a mutant. So it's a mutant that forms leaves around each kernel. So the picture helps us to know the differences between these varieties of maize. We have popcorn, which is maize ivata. Now it has the smallest grain size and it explodes on heating, which is called popping. The climatic and soil requirement for maize, for temperature, it has to do with 26 degrees Celsius to 30 degrees Celsius. And the rainfall is 75 centimeters to 150 centimeters per annum. Well-drained loamy sandy soil of about having a pH of 6 to 7 is required. Now the planting date, maize is planted twice in the south. Here we have the early maize and the late maize. The early maize is planted between March and April, while the late maize is planted between July and August. While in the north, maize is planted in June. Now the seed rates, it requires 25 kg to 30 kg per hectare. Remember, a hectare is 10,000 square meters at 2 to 3 seeds per hole. So for each hole that you plant, remember the spacing. Okay, we'll talk about spacing. At each stand where you sow, you put 2 to 3 seeds, and the depth at which you will dig the soil is 2 to 4 centimeters. Germination takes about 4 to 7 days, and the spacing between one sowing point and another sowing point, which is one plant stand to another plant stand on the same row, is 30 centimeters, while between rows is 90 centimeters. It takes, for maturity period, it takes about 2 to 3 months for maize to mature. And for, we also have what is the wet maize and the dry maize. So the wet maize is when you have the maize still um, having some moisture content, not totally dry. It takes about 60 to 90 days. But if you want dry maize where the moisture content is very low, it takes about 90 to 120 days. So maize does not require, for nursery requirement, maize does not require a nursery. Now, cultural practices, certain practices that are carried out while growing your maize plant. We have supplying, that's to replace on seeds that fail to germinate, thinning, removal of weak plants, fertilizer application. We have NPK, 200 kg per hectare, which is about 4 bags, 150 kg, that's for urea, 3 bags, that's 150 kg per hectare, 5 to 6 weeks after planting. Then farmyard manure can be used. Poultry droppings, organic manure can also be used. And weeding is done about 3 to 4 times at regular intervals. Pests and diseases are also controlled. Now, this is a machine that shows weeding of the maize plant. See another picture showing a machine carrying out mechanical weeding. Now, let's look at the pest of maize. We have stem borers. And how is it controlled? You spray insecticides like Vetox 85. You can also practice crop rotation. This also helps to break the life cycle of this pest. Grasshopper is another pest of maize and is controlled by spraying insecticide like DDT, dichlorodiphenyl trichloroethane. We also have maize weevil, which is also controlled by fumigating the store with BHC, which is benzene hexachloride or phosphocin tablets. And also early harvesting can help to control maize weevil. So this is a picture of the stem borer. You can see, as I said earlier, spray with insecticide Vetox 85 or practice crop rotation. This is maize weevil. I said fumigate with BHC, benzene hexachloride or phosphocin tablets, or you could also harvest early. Armyworms or cutworms or cut stainers, they usually feed at night, and during the day they are found in the soil or underneath ground cover. You can use insecticides to control it, like alpha permethrin or chlorpyrifos can also be used to control this pest. Now, looking at diseases of maize, we have fungal disease, maize rust, which is Puccinia polypsora, and it's an airborne. It's transmitted through the air, airborne spores which are deposited on the leaves. And the symptoms, you can see brick, brown or red spots on the leaves. There's reduced yield and also death of the crops, and it's prevented by using resistant varieties. You can also destroy the affected crops. And early planting can also be a way to prevent it. You can also use appropriate fungicides like Benlate. We have maize blight, which is a fungal disease, Herpetosporum maidis, which is transmitted by rain, splash, and wind. And the symptoms you can see is formation of lesions on the leaves. You can see the leaves, you can see these are lesions on the leaves of the plant, and you can control it by using resistant varieties or applying copper-based fungicide. We have maize streak, which is also called the leaf curl, which is a viral disease, and this is transmitted by insects called leaf hoppers. Now, viral diseases are usually transmitted by insects. Now, the symptoms are yellow streaking of the leaves. You can see the leaves, yellow streaking on the leaves. There's also deformation of the crop and reduced yield. And how do you prevent and control it? You need to get rid of the insects that transmit the disease. So you use insecticides. You can also cut and burn infected plants, which is actually called the removal or pruning of infected plants is called roguing. So you can remove the infected plants and get them burnt. Early planting can also help to control this disease, and use resistant varieties and also use clean seeds. Maize smots, a fungal disease, Histologo maidis, is transmitted by wind or airborne spores which are deposited on the fruits. You can see the picture of how this disease looks. You can see the grains, the leaves, and the tassels are covered with a large mass which is called galls of black spores. Look at it here. This is it here. So those are the symptoms, and it's prevented by uprooting and burning of the diseased plants, and you can also use healthy seeds for planting. See the picture of maize smut. You can see the galls, the black mass of galls. Okay. Now, the gray leaf spot is also a fungal disease, Cercospora zeae maidis, and is transmitted by wind or airborne Also by rain too. You can see lesions of gray spots with yellow halos. This is it, yellow halos. And it's prevented by using resistant varieties, practicing crop rotation, use of fungicides, and also weed, controlling of weeds can help to take care of this. And harvesting, processing, use, and storage of maize. How is maize harvested? Is done with a hand, cutlass, sickle, corn picker, or you could also use a combine harvester. And for the processing, the shelling of the maize can be done mechanically to remove the husk and seeds from the cobs. The shelling can be done mechanically to remove the husk and seed on the cobs. Then you now winnow. Now, what's maize used for? It can be eaten, boiled, or roasted. It can be processed into flour, golden morn, like the cereal brand and cornflakes that we are familiar with. It can also be used to make cornmeal, beer, baking flour, and livestock feed. Now, how is maize stored? It can be stored in silos, which are, if it's produced on a large scale, also cribs, rumbles, sacks, tins, or even in a fireplace on a small scale. That's a way we can store maize. The next crop we'll be looking at is rice, Oryza sativa. The varieties of rice include the upland rice and the swamp rice, or the floating rice. But the common ones we know are upland rice and swamp rice, which is also known as wet paddy. Now, upland rice, we have different varieties: Abede, E425, Oshodi, O56, Fardi, Nigeria, LAC23, LAC5 is for Liberia, and Etoda is Sierra Leone. Then for the swamp rice, we have, which is usually cultivated in waterlogged soils, we have the Toma, BG79, GFB24, Faro 12, Faro 15, Faro 21, MSML 140 stroke 10, IR8. These are examples of the varieties of swamp rice. We have floating rice, which is grown in water about 150 centimeters deep or more. Examples of such varieties are Malobadin, Fada 14, Radin China, Indochina. These are varieties of rice. Now, looking at the upland rice, it's grown in rain-fed fields, prepared and seeded when dry, much like wheat or maize. And the ecosystem is extremely diverse, including fields that are level, gently rolling or steep. And the rainfall here is just 1,000 to 4,000 meters annually. Now, this is an example of upland rice, as you can see in the picture. For swamp rice, that's rice that is grown on land covered with water for most of the year, for example, along the banks of rivers and streams. And when the water begins to rise at the beginning of the rainy season and the water begins to fall at the end of the raining season, this is where swamp rice is usually grown. This is an example of swamp rice. You can see the picture there. And this is floating rice, as I talked about, third variety. You can see about 150 centimeters deep. The temperature for rice is 20 degrees Celsius to 30 degrees Celsius, while for rainfall, we have the upland rice is 75 centimeters to 120 centimeters per annum, while swamp rice is over 250 centimeters. It requires a light and fertile soil. Now, for the land preparation, rice, the land is cleared of bush and the ridges are also made, especially we're talking about for upland rice, which can be done mechanically by plowing, harrowing, and ridging. And the rice is usually propagated by seed. The planting date for rice in the southern part of Nigeria is between April and May, while in the northern part of Nigeria is between August and September. And how is rice planted is usually by broadcast method. That's where you just carry the rice and throw it to the air. That's called broadcast method. Or sowing or drilling. That's when you plant it at determined planting distances. That's called sowing or drilling. Now, the seed rate is 65 kg per hectare at 2 to 3 seeds per hole. And the sowing depth, that's if you're using the sowing or drilling method, is 2 to 4 centimeters, while spacing is 25 centimeters to 30 centimeters apart, depending on the variety. And it also takes 4 to 7 days to germinate. And the maturity period is 4 to 7 months. Now, nursery practices for rice. It requires a nursery which is usually done in fertile water-soaked soil. And the seeds are sown in nursery around May to June and finally transplanted to the field in July to August. Now, let's look at the cultural practices. Remember, these are activities that are carried out in the course of growing rice. We have supplying and thinning, which has to do, supplying is replacing of seeds that fail to germinate. Thinning is removal of weak plants. Manuring, which is also fertilizer application, requires about 150 kg per, which is 3 bags per of NPK, that's nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium per hectare, at planting by broadcast method. So you can apply this, you can sow your seeds by broadcast method. You can also apply fertilizer by broadcast method. That's spraying it into the air and it lands. Then for weeding, it should be done regularly to ensure rapid growth of our crops. Then you also need to control pests and diseases when necessary. Now let's look at the pests of rice. We have birds, and how do you control it? By using scarecrows, or you can employ children to scare the birds off. You can also practice early harvesting. Rodents can also be controlled using traps or a fence to farm. Now, we have rice weevil, which is a store pest. You can fumigate with BHC powder or phosphocin tablets. And we also have other pests like stem borers and grasshoppers. Now, the diseases of rice, we have Pericularia oryzae, which is a fungal disease transmitted by wind and infected soils. And the symptoms are long red spots on the leaves. We also have, from the picture, you can see the symptoms: discoloration of the heads and spikes. The spikes usually lose their shape. The grains, the rice grains do not feel, they are empty, then the seeds also do not develop. And it can be prevented by using resistant varieties. You should also plant mold-free seeds and also avoid damage to seeds. You can also harvest early, burn moldy pods, and treat with fungicides as well. We have a disease called brown leaf spot, which is a fungal disease, Cercospora oryzae, transmitted by rain, splash, and wind. And the symptoms, you can see small, narrow brown spots on the leaves, as you can see. And it's prevented by planting resistant varieties. You can also uproot and burn the infected plants. And also, you need to burn crop residues before subsequent planting. So once you harvest from a particular field, the residue, which are the stalks that are left on the farmland, should be burned before you cultivate another set of rice on that. We have rice blight, which is a fungal disease, Xanthomonas oryzae, transmitted by airborne spores as well as rain splash. And the symptoms are longitudinal red or yellow spots which develop on the leaves, leading to poor yield. It can be controlled. How do you control this? Avoid the use of heavy nitrogen fertilizers. You can also use resistant varieties and also uproot and burn infected plants. Rice smut is another fungal disease, Tiletia horrida. It's spread by wind, and you can see that the grains turn into a mass of black spores, which is a symptom. Look at this here. The grains turn into a mass of black spores, and it's prevented by using resistant varieties and applying appropriate fungicide. We have the rice leaf smut, which is fungal disease, Entilloma oryzae, and it is spread by wind, airborne spores, also rain splash or irrigation. So when you irrigate your rice farm, you can also come down, the farm can come down with this disease. You can see angular black spots on the leaves. You can see the leaves, angular black spots on the leaves, and you can prevent it by seed treatment. Treat your seeds before you sow them. You can also use resistant varieties and also apply appropriate fungicides. Now, let's look at harvesting, processing, use, and storage of rice. The red heads of rice are usually cut with a knife or a sickle, which is the common term farm tool we use, or you can also use a combine harvester to harvest rice. Now let's look at the processing of rice. You have to sun dry it. This is done immediately after harvesting for 3 to 4 days. Then you thresh the grain. That's the separation of grains from the stalk by beating it with stick or treading it with your feet or using a mechanical thresher. And after that, you winnow. That's applying some form of wind. So after threshing, the chaff or unwanted dust and the remains of the stalk are removed by winnowing. That's the fanning operation done by throwing the grain into the air to blow away dust and other residues. After winnowing, the grains of rice remains enclosed in the husk to form what is called paddy rice. So whenever you see grain that has not been milled, that still has its husk on it, is called paddy rice. Okay, parboiling. This involves heating the paddy rice by putting it into boiling water for about 12 to 15 hours. Now the rice swells and the husk are forced apart. The parboiled rice is now sun-dried. Now, why do we have to parboil rice? The reason is that, one, to minimize breakage during milling. You know, rice, the paddy rice is usually milled in order to get that fine grain that we usually consume. So that milling process, if the paddy rice is not parboiled, it will now break. So to minimize breakage during milling, to improve the keeping quality of rice so that it can have a longer shelf life, it also helps the rice grain to retain protein and vitamins. And also, the parboiled rice has a greater resistance to storage pests like the rice weevil. It also facilitates this husking of the grains. That's the removal of the husk from the grains. It's achievable when the paddy rice is parboiled. Then it also helps to toughen the grains, which also could prevent breakage. The next we have is hulling. So this has to do with the removal of the husk from the grains. Now, the grains are pounded gently in order to remove the expanded husk, which has, the husk has expanded as a result of the parboiling. So the husks are then separated by winnowing. Now, polishing. In some cases, the paddy rice is stretched by a machine and polished. That's removing a particular layer. After removing the husk, there's still another layer that could be removed, and that polishing gives it that whitish color, which some don't really encourage based on nutritional basis. So polishing involves the use of specially designed machines to remove the husk and the outer layers covering the grain. So after the husk, we still have some outer layers, and polishing helps to remove those outer layers, and that portion removed is known as bran, which is usually rich in protein and vitamins. So consumption of polished rice can cause vitamin deficiency called beriberi. So these are some examples of us to see. This is the paddy rice. You can see the brown rice after the husk has been removed. Then when the rice has been polished, this is, you see, white rice. Okay. So what are the uses of rice? It can be boiled and eaten with stew. It can also be eaten as cereals as in rice and crispies. It can be ground and prepared like semovita and eaten with soup. It can be used to make starch, beer, and wine. The husk can be used as fuel. It can also serve as litter for livestock, that's the beddings, especially for poultry birds that need that warm environment. So it can be used to provide that. That's on the floor of the poultry house. The rice bran can also be used as livestock feed. Now, how is rice stored? It's stored as paddy rice, or it can be processed, or in a processed form, it can be stored in silos or jute bags. So in this lesson, we discussed cultural practices, some of which include transplanting, which has to do with transfer of seedlings from the nursery bed to their permanent positions; shading, which has to do with erecting a cover above the seedlings to protect it from harsh weather or harsh conditions; supplying, reseeding, and filling, which has to do with the replacement of seeds that fail to germinate. We also discussed the husbandry of maize, which is Z-maize. We also looked at rice, Oryza sativa, under the following headings like the variety, the climatic and soil requirements, maturity period, harvesting, processing, storage, pest and disease control, and also looked at the usage as well. Thank you so much for your time. Okay, let's take a look at some questions. The first question here says, the following factors are essential for maize production, except. So we have high temperature, low temperature, relative humidity, and adequate rainfall. So maize requires adequate rainfall, it requires relative humidity, it requires a low temperature, but it does not require a high temperature. So the answer here is high temperature. So it requires all of these except high temperature. Yam stored in barns should be inspected at least once in a week in order to A. Remove irregular shaped tubers. B. Control termite attack. C. Prevent moldiness in yam. D. Remove sprouts and rotten tubers. So the answer here is to remove sprouts and rotten tubers. If you've observed, if you've left yam for some time in your store, after some time you could observe that the tubers begin to sprout. That's to germinate, to grow. So the option here is the reason why we inspect at least once a week is to remove sprouts and tubers that are beginning to rotten. So I will encourage you to, so the answer here is D. I will encourage you to practice some more so that you can evaluate yourself better on this topic. Thank you.